This one has to be on. Yes, I can hear myself too clearly. I'll wait also for you to get off stage. Thank you for the wondrous introduction. My name is Kiran Bhat. I'm an Indian American author, and I'm so excited to speak to this lovely team of translators. Translation is something we really take for granted. There's so many languages in the world. There's so many cultures that come from these languages, and we sometimes usually just live in one culture, one language, and then we don't realize how many other things are inside other languages, inside other cultures. And then we need someone, this sort of underappreciated person who looks from this culture, is using this culture, using this language, and trying to help us get from here to here and here to here. And so we have three people who do a wondrous job doing this all the time through their own work, through their writings, through the translation projects. And there's a lot about translation that is very difficult, from the what word do we use, how we go from just this manuscript we have to getting it to a publisher, people like you who might want to read a translation. So we're going to be thinking about these questions today, and I'm very excited to have these wondrous women to help me assess what translation should mean in the 21st century. So we'll take a second, or 2-3 minutes, to introduce ourselves, talk about our translation works, what languages we use, and just a few sentences about what the translated books are about. And then if anyone is comfortable or wants to read maybe just a sentence or a poem or paragraph from their translations, they can do so. If not, we'll just continue to the next person. So I'll give myself as an example. My name is Kiran Bhat. I'm an Indian American author who lives in Mumbai. I've lived all over the world, and so I have a wide range of languages I use. My languages of translation are English, Kannada, my mother tongue, Spanish, and Portuguese. And I'm very interested in what it means to create more spaces for indigenous people who are living in the different parts of the world, be it Africa, indigenous Americas, the Pacific, to have space in South Asia, to have their work understood in a South Asian context. So my book of translation involved Mayan poetry. I used to live in Mexico, and I have translated 2 books from 2 different types of indigenous people from the Seltal and Tzotzil community. And I have translated 1 book into English that is a collective of poets named the Snichimal Vaichil, who write about femicide, gender violence, ecological problems, general issues facing the Mayan communities of Chiapas. And that has been translated into English. And then I have a set of haikus, which was written by Antonio Guzman. And that was in Seltal, and I used Spanish to bring it into English in my mother tongue, Kannada. And so it's one side Seltal, Spanish, English, Kannada, the mother tongues and the national languages. So those are my 2 projects, and those are the spaces from which I write from and the work I do. Ashwini, do you want to now maybe present a little bit about yourself and your work?
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much, Kiran. So I love doing translations because I love languages. And I like to go deep into languages. I like to read their literature, both from ancient times to the modern times. So I know, for example, ancient Greek, Sanskrit, which is another ancient language. And then I know some modern languages like German, Marathi, Hindi. But even these modern languages, go back quite a lot. And so, for example, if you're trying to read Faust, the original Faust in German, it's almost like a different language. Or if you're trying to read Naneshwari in Marathi, you do need, help of dictionaries sometimes, because it's closer to Prakrit than to modern Marathi at times. So my point is, or like, when you're reading Kabir or Tulsidas, then you also, realize that the languages like Braj and Avadhi are a lot different than the modern Hindi. So I just like dwelling into languages, but my basic training is in philosophy, and my first book that I published was in philosophy, which is Sapiens and Siddha Prajna, which was a comparative philosophical book. And I felt like, so many people would come and ask me questions like, why did you compare these 2 ancient cultures, and how can we understand that? And I have a habit of talking to people who are interested in these issues, no matter what their background is. So some people didn't understand English so well, and they thought perhaps that was a problem in understanding these concepts, and that would have definitely contributed. But these concepts can be very complex at times. So I thought, okay, I'll give it a try and see if I can start with Hindi. and then I translated that in Hindi. And normally I write for academic population, but I also started a blog writing about these issues or these concepts for lay people who don't have any academic interest or who don't really care for footnotes, roughly speaking, but they want to know, what can you get out of it? So that was my reason why I decided to translate my own book in Hindi. But I had to tell you that it wasn't easy to begin with. It took me a long time to figure out the process and to see, how much to dilute and whether to write it for and absolutely, anybody who has some basic education in Hindi, or to write it for, people who are interested in Sahitya. So at some point, when I started teaching Hindi at Oxford, I realized that there's a lack of Sahityik literature, which is in modern literature, in philosophy, in Hindi Sahitya. And I thought, perhaps I could contribute to that as well. So instead of diluting it to the point of making it available to absolutely everybody, we decided to stick to the text and just do the translation, keeping the complexity intact. And thankfully, I also had a help of a native Hindi speaker, PhD student in philosophy, who also enjoys thinking about all these concepts. So we kind of came up, with that idea. But if I do, another translation, let's say Marathi, which is my mother tongue, then I do wonder. I mean, I'm sort of doing it both for fun. It's fun for me, but I think it also sort of helps people understand these concepts, and they have a practical utility value as well. So I had a long practice of philosophical counseling based on these concepts, and to see how these ancient notions of detachment or notions of developing understanding and knowledge of oneself and the others, how they help us, in developing notions like mindfulness, self-love, and things like that. So anyway, so to cut it short, that's basically my entire perspective on translation.
Thank you. Varsha, please tell about yourself.
Yeah, hello. So I'm not an academic. I just jumped into translation for the fun of it. And why? Because, around 2019-20, a lot of things were happening in Delhi, and I was in the government, and I was quite disillusioned. And then I read Hindi novels, and I found that whatever is happening on the ground is being captured in these novels, and I wanted to share it. I wanted to share it with my friends initially. So for the purpose of sharing it, I had to translate. And so I would compose these long text messages and send it to my friends, and dekho kya likha hai. And then, I sent it to the author of this book, which is Ram Bhakt Rangbaz. And this book is about a small town mohalla. A mohalla which is a prototype for any Indian, kasbe ka mohalla. And L.K. Advani's Rath Yatra is about to enter this mohalla, and the Mandal Commission agitation has just ended. Now, this mohalla is a prototype, a feudalistic, casteist, and misogynist mohalla, like any Indian, Central Indian mohalla is. And in this mohalla, there is no consciousness of communalism to that extent. People are mildly communist. They will say some things, but they're not communal in the sense. And there's a central character called Ashik Rangbaz, Ashik Mia, who's a very popular tailor, and the women especially love him, and they confide to him, they chat to him. And as the Rath comes nearer and nearer, the discourse in the mahalla starts changing. People start speaking in a different tongue. And I found this very powerful because I feel that n number of non-fiction books have been written about this. But to kind of capture the texture of the emotional experience of people, for the first time ever, when a new kind of politics started emerging in this country, what happened? How did how did loyalties change? How did discourse change? So I wanted to translate this book. And without having any knowledge about publishing or about translation or about academic, I just jumped into it. I shared it with the author, and who said that, why don't you go ahead? And then, this process of discovery and a joyful discovery of engagement with language or with the weight of the words, this started for me. And I didn't do it for anyone, I did it for myself, but I think I learned so much from it, and I'm constantly learning, and it has been so rewarding because it changes your relationship with language. When we write only in English, we have a kind of English which is at a distance from the language of the experience that we are writing about, because our experiences are very Indian. They are happening in Hindi or Marathi or Kannada, but we are writing them in English. But when we translate that relationship, I found it, relationship with language underwent a change, and it was a wonderful experience for me, and I've come to talk about it. So I'll now pass on to Anju.
Good afternoon. My name is Anju Makhija. I'm a poet, playwright, and translator. To answer Kiran's question, I know he has quite a few, so I'll keep it brief. I've introduced myself, and if and when time permits, I will focus on the two books I've translated. The first is called Seeking the Beloved. It's the poetry of Shah Abdul Latif, and he's a Sufi Sindhi poet. And this book was published 10 years ago and went on to win the Sahitya Academy Award, and is still in publication, luckily for me, I guess. And the next book is called Freedom and Fishers, which is partition poetry from India and Pakistan. Now, I don't want to talk about the process of translation unless you want me to. You want me to read the poems? Okay. So I will let him ask me to talk about, when the process. So read one poem. What I'll do is I'll read a poem from Freedom and Fishers. Yesterday when we had a session, there were a lot of young people, really young people. Today, I think all of you all are students or teachers, or it would be nice to know who I'm reading to, some of you all. Teachers? Students? What are you all? Readers. Okay, we have readers. Because yesterday there were so many students, no, when we had a session. Yeah. Okay, with the communal strife that is going on in our midst, never ending. My own parents came from Pakistan. We are Sindhis, and I was born after here. But I kept on hearing about it. And there's no end to the strife. It goes on and on and on. And then I came across a poet called Sheikh Ayaz. If you all know anything about Pakistani poets, he's very famous. And there's a very simple, short poem, since he wants me to read. And I think we should all... It's a very simple poem. And... that doesn't mean it's a bad poem. It's simple and not complex, making it easier to translate, of course. So, and he's really, really a well-known poet, if you all want to Google him, other side of the border. The poem is called The Ali's Declaration. This is really for you all to all say it as well. It starts with, say it today, I have no country. I have no country, the universe I call home. I have no name, a human being I am. I have no Bible, no Gita, no Quran. The earth is my mother, in her I trust. Yeah, it is. That's why I said simple but very effective poem. And it was interesting, once we read it to students, and they said, ma'am, can we say it after you? because they felt so emotional about it. So, say today, I have no country, the universe I call home. I have no name, a human being I am. I have no Bible, no Gita, no Quran. The earth is my mother, in her I trust. Centuries old chains have snapped. Are you aware of that? Centuries old chains have snapped. Are you aware of that? Break it today, break it today, the prison of your mind. Say today, say today, the Ali's Declaration. And that's the title of the poem.
Yes, yes, I was giving everyone the mic. But regardless, those were such beautiful translations, Anju ma'am. Thank you for sharing it with us. I'm sure a lot of us will be. You have some copies in the bookstore, now? Yeah, please. So yes, yeah. So yeah, please. If you're interested in these translations, please go and try to find them after we're done, and we'll be love. I'm sure she'd love to speak more about them. For now, let us. Interestingly enough, we're talking about the breaking of fissures and bonds in another way, because translation, in a certain way, is breaking the bonds of one language and repermutating a text into another. So, what does translation mean for you, Varsha? What do you think translation means?
So when I jumped into translation, I thought that it was just conveying the meaning of the text. And as I started, proceeding, I realized that it's the dictionary which deals with meanings. Uh, a, a text, a novel, a fiction, work of fiction, it deals with the way the words are put together, how meaning is constructed, and that meaning is metaphorical, that is extra textual. So some like more and more when I was translating, I needed to move away from the literal text. Like, there's this phrase, BA pass karenge, Lalu VP baas karenge. So I was trying to translate it. And then, I not only had to recreate the text, this slogan in English, but also the force of it. And unless you recreate the force of it, the reader in English will not get any pleasure. So then, after a long time, I ended up writing, BA, MA, we will do, Lalu, VP, we will screw. So, because bamboo has that implication. So, just bumbling around, stumbling around. I had so much fun. And this book is full of, dialects, Bhojpuri, Methil, Ramayana shloks, then Padhe Farsi, Beche Tel, these kind of, and the way of speaking, like the Bihari speaker will speak like desh to ab dub hi gaye ho. Now, unless you recreate the force of that way of speaking in English, you are just, conveying a dead meaning, which will not give any pleasure to the reader. So I realized that for me, translation was recreating the pleasure of reading the original in a new language. And for that, many times you have to move around, sometimes you have to add sentences, sometimes you have to delete some things which cannot be reproduced just like that in English. And it was a joyful journey.
Wonderful. Very insightful. You have straddled so many different languages. You've lived in so many different places, US, UK, India. What is it about these mix of these different places you've lived in, the different languages you use? How do they come across when you're translating a book and you're working in these different ways of thinking?
Yeah, well, it's kind of very interesting, what she just said right now, and like how you translated to give them the joy of, how it would feel when you're reading into another dialect. So I don't have, I have slightly different problems. Like my problem arises when one word in English has several different, synonymous words in the language that I'm translating it in. And then, for example, here, I was struggling with the word concept, whether I should call it sankalpana or avadharana or just dharana or, anything else. And the question is like, which word is going to attract which reader, and would it like, make them would it just scare them away? And when you're translating non-fiction, then it's not fun. I'm afraid it's like it's a lot of work, and I love doing fun stuff as well. But when you're translating a non-fiction stuff, then it just is like a lot of choices to be made.
What about you, Anju? Are there any problems or certain things you'd like to meditate on?
I think what we've been discussing here as well is a process we often refer to as transcreation.
Yes.
And there's been a whole lot of debate over, I think, almost 2 decades now, that I think some people are smiling. They know the word, transcreation. Now, it's sort of a word which allows you to, as she said, not translate word by word or, look for the exact right words. I know people who change it quite a lot. They drop paras, they might drop entire passages. The idea is that you have the original language, right? Which might be Marathi or Sindhi or whatever. It has to work in the target language. Which is the target? People are saying exactly they know. So tell me the target language for many people is English. Need not be. Because I think the big experiment taking place today in translation is people are translating from language to language. That's where the funding is also, by the way, people who are looking for funding. If you translate from one Indian language to another, the Sahitya Academy has many programs like that. Because there's no need to go via English to, another language, like from Hindi to Gujarati to Marathi or whatever else. So supposing she wanted to do it, she could have gone directly to another language. And that, in a way, has advantages too. Because of our, colonial past, we are so dependent on English. We need not be. And so when you talk of transcreation, you take liberties. The only thing I remember, personally, I can't speak for everybody else, is I try to stick to the original meaning. Which doesn't mean that I don't, drop lines in poetry. I do, quite often. Because what works in Hindi, Sanskrit, like repetition, does not work in English. So if I have to get my English reader interested, it has to work in his head, her head, as a separate English. Now, as you know, the awards that have been coming in the past, Daisy Rockwell and all that, I mean, if you read those novels, they work like as if they were written originally. Not like we struggle to say that, nor should we take liberties. Now, you spoke of bamboo. I don't know what kind of liberty that is, but some might say that is taking, when you say, sorry to use it, the word, as she said, screw you to sing, I mean, is that taking a liberty? People might question. Because
People will always question.
No.
I think people will always question, and I think every translation is your interpretation of a text.
Interpretation?
Interpretation in the sense of how you shape the words of the original in another language. So, you have something called a chapati, and now you're making a bread. The ingredients may be similar, but you're creating something else. And how do you do it? The recipe will vary.
I'd like to ask this also, if I may, with Kiran. How much should we stay with the original? Remember, this work belongs. Okay, you answer this, Kiran. I know you translated a lot.
Yeah, sure. And I'm also extremely interested in this idea of transliteration versus, I think any of us who happen to translate have to consider this question. And in my case, I'll answer your question, then I'll ask another question. I think I'm definitely on team what is the word you said?
Transcreation.
Thank
but
you.
Should
yes.
you stay? Should you stay true to the original, or just go on a tangent anyway?
So let me say, we have an original, and I'll tell you this. This will also depend if you're doing fiction, non-fiction, poetry. For me, as someone who predominantly translates poetry, what is the swabhav of what this person is trying to say? What is the essence? And that is what I want to translate. What is the emotional flavor that this person is wanting to give, and how do I give the same feeling in English or in Kannada? It would be especially because I am also a translator who's working in very different cultures. So that also creates another issue, because if you're working Indian to Indian or even Indian to Western, it's one thing. But when you're working Mayan or Spanish as well to an Indian, or there's another layer of even cultural difference, you know? So there are absolutely things that my poets will say that will make no sense to an Indian or will make no sense to someone from this part of the world. So I have to consider, do I keep it? Now, I would not probably create an Indian expression that equivalates it. That would be too much creation. That would be when I'm really creating, you know? But I might omit. I might decide, okay, I'm not going to go into that. I'll use another expression. But I have to make the reader entranced. I have to make them want to read that poem. And I want them to feel like this is Cecilia Diaz. I want to read Cecilia Diaz. I want to read Antonio Guzman. I want to get their next book. So absolutely, for me, it's very important to keep them excited. So, and you can't do that if you're just going word by word. So I want to ask how many, I'm sure all of us are more on the side of, we have to be to some extent, but is there anyone who wants to defend really like word for word or sentence by sentence translation? Is there anyone here?
No,
I was going to,
because academic wise, I think she's forced to stick word by word.
Yeah, true. And we have to. We absolutely have to. In fact, even when this is
It's working,
Yeah.
Put it close.
yeah, even when I'm teaching my students, like, I tell them, even if this sounds like absolutely nonsensical, we want to know that you're able to translate word for word and then write into bracket if the sentence doesn't make any sense to you. But that's the sort of demand of academic work. That doesn't mean when you're translating, especially a fictional text, then you can always take liberties with it. If it's non-fictional text, as long as you carry the meaning to the reader, that's sufficient. But that does always raise questions. I mean, there are questions raised while translating at every step of the way. If you're too literal, that's a problem. If you're too, if you're too much, if you're taking liberty too much, that's a problem. And even when you're doing literary translation, the question is is it making sense into another language? So when you're dealing with different languages, it's a conceptual problem and it's a translation problem.
I have another problem here, is that now if you're translating and there are students, are you going to be giving a lot of notes and references at the back? How important is that in translation, in your opinion?
I'm not sure. Are you saying while I
The
teach?
references, the notes, and I mean, footnotes at the back. Is that very important translation? Because I
Right.
know people who have said there's no need for footnotes or explanations. That's it.
There's always a need for footnotes and explanations when you're working with academic writing. So you can't escape that. But if it's not academic writing, and if you see that, in advance that we are not doing this for academic purpose, but we are trying to reach a different audience, then you can take the liberties that you like. So yeah.
So I want to ask one final question to these audience members before we open up to audience. We are talking about translation, the nitty-gritty, the getting the words right, but there's another aspect that we all have to consider, which is getting it from this here to that there. So if any of you are comfortable, what was your publishing process like? How did you get someone in India, anywhere? Like Abdul Latif is someone we have to think about. You take this book and publish it. Like, how did you go from this thing I want people to read to getting it in a physical book and getting it published and out in the world? Do you want to?
I'll keep it brief. I know time is a factor here. I think I just got also lucky because I chose a Sindhi poet of the 16th century. And the person who translated it with me, he came up to me at a seminar and said, I think you should translate this. I said, but I hardly speak Sindhi. How do you expect me to do? He said, I'm there, we'll work together. His name was Hari Dilgir, and a foremost poet in Sindhi. I said, why not? He was 80 years old that time, by the way. So if any of you all are feeling old. So he said, I said, okay, I'll give it a try if you have confidence in me. He said, yeah. So this was about more than 10 years when we were corresponding by postcards and all that. And he would send a postcard on Friday with 2 verses. And it's quite a fat book. It's called Shahjo Risalo. It's a 16th century. And, talking about something you just picked up on the way by an unknown author. He's quite famous, like Rumi, Mirdad. He's famous in Germany. His original Risalo is at the British Museum. So you're dealing with, okay, also academia in a way. It's not what I feel like translating or. But we took a chance and we did it. And and to answer Kiran's question specifically, I did send literally a cold letter to several publishers. Lucky enough to have Oxford say yes, Katha say yes. Oxford said 3 years. I said forget it. Katha said okay, fast. So it's published by Katha, and it's still in print. It's still on Amazon. So that's why I started by saying I'm lucky in that.
Varsha, you worked with some big publishers as well, like Westland and all these spaces. Do you want to speak about your process?
So my process was to completely hit and run, but I've been writing for a while, so I am accustomed to rejections. So I kept sending, and writing detailed book proposals, fighting for the book, and basically curating the book for the publishers, because the publishers want to know how much it would sell and why is it relevant, and a lot of them would not touch it because of its political nature. So Westland is one publishing house which always takes up stuff which others will not pick up, especially the political stuff. They are not lily-livered. So I think Kartika was very prompt, but the process itself took more than a year after translation. So, that's the publishing. But I would say that you should not take rejections close to the heart. And nowadays, there are a lot of competitions for the emerging translators. So you should try your hand, and, winning a competition kind of tells you that you have it in you. People reject book proposals for several reasons which have got nothing to do with the quality of the translation or the quality of your writing as such. So it's a process which kind of is supposed to inure you to the judgment of the others, and only when you are inured to the judgments, only then you can write or translate. So I think.
And Ashwini, do you have anything you want to say about this process?
Yeah, I mean, I completely agree with you, Varsha, that rejections are the order of the day, and you sometimes have to have patience for years before you get, before you meet the right kind of publisher. So you just have to be prepared for that. You have to persevere. And if you believe in your work, then it'll show up somewhere. And book publishing is not the only option. You can do a blog. You can just find different avenues, such as bookshops or cafes where you can present your work, or friends. It doesn't have to be extremely formal either. So if you get lucky and you meet the right publisher and you publish it, that's great. But if not, don't stop being creative.
Like to add just one thing, that the process of editing is very educative. So when you are doing it with a publisher, the kind of editing process that you go through, it teaches you a lot about how the text is being received by people who are accustomed to reading text. So that I found that it is worth going through the stress of getting it published. I would say that.
Yes. So we're at the point where we have to take audience questions, and already we have someone very excited to ask. Can someone get a mic and start passing it around? Or shall I give this one? And yeah, you just take that. You take the traveling mic and just come. Yeah, give it to. Is this no? Hello, hello. Is it audible? This is audible. Yeah. Okay. Good. Go ahead, please.
Hi, my name is Richa, and I'm turning to the experts for a constant dilemma of mine. So I've written a detective fiction series called Kanpur Khufia Private Limited, by virtue of which there's a lot of meaty, hearty expressions in there. I tend to use a lot of colloquial language. There's a lot of avadhi that I've been using as well. Now my publishers have come to a standpoint where it's constantly being debated. I was discouraged initially. I just wanted to know from your point of view, your point of view on footnotes and glossary, and what is the balance between just a pedantic, mindless translation of everything and without compromising comprehension. So, where is that middle ground, and what do you think about footnotes and glossaries?
I would say that in literature, especially if it's a work of fiction, the footnotes should be avoided if there is a lengthy glossary. Although God of Small Things has a glossary. A recent novel that I reviewed, it's a Nepalese novel, Kanchi. It has a glossary. But, it is if it is meant for the Indian market, I think glossary can be done away. Suppose it is like God of Small Things was going in the world market, so they needed to add a glossary. But most Indians who are reading God of Small Things get the meaning from the sentences themselves. So that is my view.
I think these trends, and I will use the word trends, keep on changing as well. The recent work in poetry, and Kiran may want to add to that, I've seen many Hindi, Marathi words used without translation. I tend to personally include some kind of a glossary. I use a lot of Hindi, Marathi, and other words in my poems, and I leave the original. I don't want to look for the right word necessarily. So if I feel it's not commonly known, then I will give a note. But if you feel it's a common thing, and now with Google, anybody can Google anything, you know. So that's another thing, you know. But I've been told by some people that is there Google? Why do you need? But you may need if it's a very complex thing in one language which is not translated to the other. I don't know what Kiran feels about that.
I have a similar opinion as a lot of the people. I think I lean towards let the reader figure it out, and if it is something that is extremely. But I think one thing we're giving away that is very important is context is so subjective. What is your native context? What someone else's native context is so different, and we cannot be responsible for it because there's too many contexts in the planet, and we cannot assume that everyone will know everything. I think what she said is very valid. If you feel responsible and you really want to go out and do a glossary, you do it. But I am of the belief that, yeah, it's
I would just add one thing that as decolonials, we are pushing the boundaries of English. We should push the boundaries of English. पे ये हमारी वाली English है. It is not their British English. So as long as we are in that thing ना कि हमारी अंग्रेजी वैसी होनी चाहिए, तो we feel constrained कि हर चीज़ का meaning लिखना चाहिए अगर किसी को नहीं समझ आया. But
after this, we'll go to another question.
See, I think we've been away from the British for a long time. I don't have to tell you all exact time. I think this debate went on for the first 20 years in literature. Maybe she will vouch for that. I think in the past, at least 25, 30 years, no one cares that whether we are using the original English. Nobody uses the original English. Right from Salman Rushdie to so many people. You call it chutnify the language or whatever words being used. So I don't think anybody is worried about using the original English. Do you want to say something?
Well, I think language evolves all the time, and as a linguist, I can see that there's a standard language or Praman Bhasha, and then there are different versions of Bhasha or different versions of dialects, and whether it's colloquial or written. So language constantly evolves, and I would say, I would add just one more thing to your question, is that you have to, first of all, specify who your audience is. And once you figure out who your audience is, then just sort of be consistent with whatever approach you choose. But any approach is an option.
That would be my final point. Any option is valid. Any option is good. It's up to what is important for you. Anyone else have a question? Yeah, please go ahead.
Hi. Okay.
Hello.
So I wanted to ask, if you are choosing to opt forward to a translation, how do you find the equivalence of a word, and would you take this equivalence in context to being true to the author or to be true to the reader who's going to read it?
Okay, so I guess in my case, I had the luxury that I was the author of the original book as well, and so I didn't have to deal with that problem. But anytime you're writing a book, you're writing for the reader, so you have to be, sort of religiously loyal to the reader, and then but then you don't know what the reader is, and there's not just one reader as such, right? And again, as we saw, that the language evolves, but you have to kind of stick to one consistent principle and, choose the words accordingly. And I think it's very difficult to do a literal translation when you're publishing a work. It's okay to say to the students for us, because we want to check that they actually understand the original language. But when you're doing it for an audience, then again, you can take liberties.
I think we're being told we have time for about one more question. So anyone who has, yeah, you go ahead. Go ahead.
Indian typically speaks 3 languages.
Huh.
Understands
At least I think, yes, all of us. I think all of us do, yes. Huh.
So be it spoken or written, how do you know a translation has landed or not landed?
So who wants to answer first? Since I'm having a visceral reaction, so I'll just tell you, I don't think you can know. I think you just have to do your best job and hope someone understood it. But I don't feel like, yeah, you add one.
You seem confused with some translation you may have done, right? Whether it's landed or not landed. What do you feel?
Yeah, what do you feel?
I have to answer my own question.
Yeah, please.
No, you have to be true to yourself first. You cannot only write for the reader. If you're not true to yourself, every reader will see through it.
Right.
Whatever you're writing.
So when it's spoken, it's very easy. You come to know the reaction of the person. When it's written, I have no idea what the answer is. I have no idea. That's
Read it
my
out
question.
Read it out, she suggested, in blogs, feedbacks, and
I would say that language is very oral, language has to be heard. So when you are translating, when you read the Hindi original or Marathi, whatever you are translating, whatever your source language, when you read it aloud, you hear it in a certain way which causes certain amount of feelings inside you, and that is why it's a pleasurable experience. So when I was doing my translation, my first 2 drafts were very wooden, very shoddy. बिकॉज वही है ना कि जब तुम उनको पढ़ रहे हो वो मज़ा नहीं आ रहा है तो मज़ा नहीं आ रहा है इसलिए यू हैव टू रीड इट अलाउड and you have to, when you read it aloud, if you have done plays or theater, you have to speak with emotion.
Correct.
And when you start speaking, you also, the word comes to you. That it's not walking, it may be shuffling, it may be lurching, it may be swaying, it may be, whatever. So every word has a weight, and when you read it aloud again and again, it will come to you.
Makes sense.
Because you will embody the meaning, and then you will realize कि ये word नहीं जम रहा है.
Correct.
So that is the process that I followed.
Makes sense. Makes sense.
Well, thank you so much for coming to listen to us talk about translation.